Okay, so this is going to be the part of the lecture where we talk about the evolution of eukaryotic cells, right? So we're starting with Roman numeral 4 of the outline, looking at letter A, the origin of eukaryotic cell. So how is it that we get from a prokaryotic cell with DNA but no membrane inside, no membranes at all, right? Our phospholipid bilayer is only on the outside, and how do we get a structure that has lots of different organelles inside with membranes, and we have very specialized organelles, the mitochondria and the chloroplast, to create energy. So there are two answers to this, right? So there are two features we need to answer. One is, number one, infolding of the plasma membrane to form the endomembrane system. Okay, so we're looking at this step here, infolding of the plasma membrane. I have a more detailed image here, right? So we have our ancestral cell with our DNA here, and the cytoplasm, the plasma membrane starts to fold in towards the DNA. It eventually forms a bilayered envelope around the DNA, forming the nucleus. And then the other portions of that plasma membrane that came in become all part of that endomembrane system. So remember the endomembrane system. I'm going to tell you the organelles, or probably jog your memory. So the nucleus is part of the endomembrane system. Then we have the ER, right? So the membrane is continuous with the ER and the smooth ER and the rough ER. And then the ER can bud away and fuse with the Golgi. So the Golgi is part of that endomembrane system. And then vesicles that travel between those organelles are part of the membrane system, so vesicles. And then the plasma membrane at the surface is also part of that, right? Because those vesicles can fuse with the plasma membrane. So all of those structures I just mentioned, the nucleus, the ER, the Golgi, those vesicles, those are all in the plasma membrane. Those are all part of the system because they sort of developed from that membrane on the outside of the cell and are continuous with each other inside the cell. So that's how we formed the endomembrane system, by these infoldings of the of the plasma membrane. How did we get our energy producing structures of the cell? How did we get our mitochondria and our chloroplasts? Because those are very complicated structures. So the theory is, the endosymbiotic theory states that at some point the mitochondria was some kind of prokaryotic cell. It was an aerobic cell because it uses oxygen. It was a heterotroph, right? It had to take in food, like the mitochondria needs to take in the breakdown of sugar, right? Pyruvate becomes acetic acid, and then the acetic acid goes into the mitochondria to make ATP. So the theory states that these free living cells, these prokaryotic cells, entered into a larger host cell, kind of like a parasite entering into a host. But the presence of the mitochondria was beneficial for the host because it cranked out ATP. So now this larger cell gets more ATP than it would have otherwise. The same is true for the chloroplast. So the chloroplast was at one time a free-living prokaryotic cell which was photosynthetic. It came into a cell, the host cell, a larger cell, and because this chloroplast, right, whatever the cell is, could harness the sunlight, and also create organic compounds like glucose, it was beneficial for the host cell. So we have two parasites that ended up being beneficial for the host cell. So it was a cooperative sort of living situation, right? So the host cell's happy, the mitochondria is happy, the chloroplast is happy because they're protected and they have this outer cell that supplies things like nutrients. And so over time, and we're talking billions of years, these prokaryotes lost the other life-sustaining capabilities that they had because they were no longer needed, because the larger host cell took care of all those sort of housekeeping chores, and the mitochondria and the chloroplast became specialized to just do that one function they have, either to make ATP or to generate organic molecules via photosynthesis. So that is endosymbiosis. So that explains the presence of our more complex organelles, the mitochondria and the chloroplast. And one evidence for this is that both the mitochondria and the chloroplast still have DNA, right? They still contain mitochondrial DNA and chloroplast DNA, and they are also both double membraned. So when they came into the host cell, they probably took some of that membrane with them, and so they remained double membraned now in the present time. So interesting. Those are the two working hypotheses or theories out there of how we originated a eukaryotic cell from prokaryotic cells. So let's take a look at our survey of some eukaryotic cells. We're going to look at the kingdom Protista. So the kingdom Protista, right? This chapter deals with the evolution of microbes. So protists fall under this category because many of them, not all of them, but many of them are microscopic. You need a microscope to see them. So the three basic categories for protists, okay, the kingdom Protista, are protozoans, which are animal-like cells. They're animal-like. What that really means is that they're heterotrophs. They need to eat other substances for their carbon. We have algae, which are plant-like. So they're not true plants, but they behave like plants because they can photosynthesize. And then we have something called slime molds that are fungus-like. They're not true fungi, but they are also, they sort of look like and behave like fungi, but they're not, by definition, fungi. Okay, so if we look at just what unifies everything, what does the kingdom Protista mean? It's hard because they're so different. The kingdom Protista is a large kingdom of the domain Eukarya. So remember, now we're in the domain Eukarya that don't really fall into one neat category. So there are some cells that are animal-like and some cells that are plant-like and some cells that are fungal-like. So to say there's one characteristic is kind of difficult, but if you look at the list in your notes, these are all eukaryotes, so that's definitely a characteristic, right? They're eukaryotic cells. They're not fungi, animals, or plants, and they're mostly unicellular, right? So some of them will be multicellular. They are going to be ancestral to all other eukaryotes, and they need a watery or moist habitat to survive. So you're not going to find them in the desert. You're going to have to find some water to have some protists. So they live in both saltwater and freshwater. Anywhere there's water, you're going to find protists. Okay, so we're going to move through just the three different kinds. So we're going to look at protozoans first. So here they can be parasitic. They're mostly unicellular. There's a category of these guys called mixotrophs. So you know, the word heterotroph is here, right? So most of your protozoans are heterotrophs, but there's a subset called mixotrophs that can both photosynthesize and they're heterotrophs. So they got both. They could do everything. So this is a picture of something called a trypanosome. This is a protist. This is one cell that can infect your blood, and this is a red blood cell. So you can see the size approximation, and this causes something called African sleeping sickness. So it's a pathogen. This is a euglena. We saw this in lab. I forget now whether it was live or if it was a still image. I think it was just a slide. But this little red spot here, that's its eye spot, so it can see light versus dark, and it can move towards the light if it wants to photosynthesize. It also has a flagellum. We have algae here, so we have a photosynthetic organism. This is a multicellular algae because it's large. You don't need a microscope to see this. And this is what's called slime mold. So it kind of looks, in this is on a pile of leaves, maybe on the forest floor, a damp forest floor. But this orange structure here is a slime mold. When you look at it, it might look like mold, right? You don't think it's slime mold, this category of protist. All right, so let's look at, this is the slide that just tells you that they're very diverse. So you find them in all different kinds of watery environments. Leaf litter is what you call all the leaves on the forest floor. There are in bodies of host organisms sometimes, so they can be out in the nature or they can be inside of organisms. They're inside of unicellular algae and reef-building coral animals, and they're inside of termites. So there are some protists that digest the wood that termites eat. So termites themselves can't digest the wood, which is funny. They have the mouth and the teeth that gnaw at the wood to get the wood inside their gut. But once the wood is there, they can't digest it. It's the protists that digest it. And these are some pictures of those protists. But really, so if you want to kill termites, you want to kill those protists that digest the food for them. And then they would die of starvation. Okay, so let's take a look at our protozoans. These are animal-like protists. Animal-like meaning that they're heterotrophs. They are grouped according to their mode of locomotion. So do they have flagella? Do they have pseudopods? Do they have cilia? So let's take a look at this. So the first, this is just an appreciation of the different kinds of protists. This is a Giardia lamblia. This is a flagellated protist. This is another flagellated protist. Amoebas, these extensions of the cell are called pseudopods. We know what cilia look like. Right? Cilia are these hair-like extensions on the surface of a cell. And apicomplexan is named for this little feature here. We'll get to that in just a second. All right, so let's take a look at our first slide on flagellates. Flagellates have to have flagella. They tend to be free-living, but some are parasites. The one I listed for you, Giardia lamblia, is a really tough protist that causes a diarrheal infection if we accidentally drink it. It's found in natural springs and natural little rivers or streams in the mountain. And so if you drink mountain water without filtering it and without treating it, you could be drinking these guys and they can cause diarrhea. Now, giardial diarrhea lasts a very long time, 3 weeks, 6 weeks, a very, very long time. So just think about the discomfort of what you have when you have diarrhea for a day and multiply that for a month, and that's giardia. There's also a sexually transmitted infection called Trichomonas vaginalis that's caused by a protist, a flagellated protist. I'm going to go ahead and link these videos to your module so you can take a look at them and you can get a nice visual image of what these guys really look like. The second category are amoebas. So the amoebas move around with pseudopods. Pseudopods are these extensions of the cell to engulf their prey to eat, right? So we've seen this in class before. I will again link the video to the module. And this is just a funny cartoon where this amoeba is writing, "Dear Daphne, how I long to run my pseudopods through your cilia," because his love, Daphne, is a ciliated protist. Apicomplexans, these are a group that probably none of you have heard of, but perhaps you have heard of malaria. So malaria is caused by a microbe in this group, and apicomplexans, again, are named after this feature that they all have, this apical complex. It's just a way to that why they call them apicomplexans. They're all going to be parasitic, so they're all going to cause some kind of disease. This one, the word plasmodium is the name of the agent that causes malaria. So it's the protist that causes malaria. There's another really interesting one that falls in this category called toxoplasm. And toxoplasma is found in cats and people who handle cat litter. So that what happens is this parasite will have its cyst in the cat poop. And so if you handle cat litter, you might get contaminated on your hands with this toxoplasma. And if you eat before washing your hands or something goes in your mouth and it's contaminated because you didn't wash your hands, then you can get infected with toxoplasma. And there's a really interesting, if you look this up, it's really interesting that it actually affects males and females differently. It actually goes to your brain. It affects your behavior in certain ways. Just really quickly, females tend to be a little bit more social when they're infected with toxoplasma. They actually really love cats. So if you've ever if you have a friend who's very social and has a ton of cats, it might be a red flag that they might be infected by toxoplasma. And for males, it makes them a little bit less social, kind of reclusive, and more of a risk taker. So isn't that kind of interesting? Excuse me. So I'll link this plasmodium. It's called the Plasmodium hunter. So back to malaria. What malaria does is that it infects your red blood cells and it completely destroys your red blood cells. And if you looked at a person's blood smear who had malaria, you'd see this red blood cell here, and then you'd see a ring-shaped structure inside the red blood cell. That's malaria. So this is the plasmodium inside your red blood cell, and it's eating all of the proteins inside of that red blood cell. And eventually it will break open, releasing all the toxins that it's built up inside your red blood cell, which gives you the fever of malaria. So it's a really nasty protist. Okay, so that's our Apicomplexans. Now we have our ciliates. So ciliates are ciliated, right? They're going to move around via their cilia. They're going to have the heterotrophs and mixotrophs. So I will link again the paramecium. So paramecium is going to be our poster child for a ciliate. And this is actually not a paramecium. This is something else, but it does show a nice ciliated body. So you guys can take a look at paramecium moving around with their cilia. And we are done with protozoans. So let's look at slime molds. Slime molds, there's two kinds. There's plasmodial and cellular. And they're going to be predominantly decomposers, right? So they're decomposers on the forest floor. They can be large, and this is what we looked at earlier. So let me show you another picture. So this is a plasmodial slime mold. So you can see sort of like the filamentous structures that they make. These larger structures, those are the parts that make the reproduction portion of their body. But it looks kind of like mold, right? Except it's slimy. Mold is fuzzy. Then there's something called the cellular slime mold that look more like amoeba. So this is a really cool video. I'm going to highly recommend you see this video because the cellular slime molds, they are single-celled, but they come together and they form this colony that just starts to organize themselves into one large creature. So it's really cool. It's kind of like this border, like they gray the line between unicellular and multicellular organisms. So you're going to see, if you watch this video, you're going to see the swarming stage. You're going to see the stage where they actually generate a stalk to create a reproductive structure. Okay, so I highly recommend that. But slime molds is your fungal-like protist here. All right, so there's our slime mold again. And this is, you're going to see this in the video. So this is that unicellular. So you see the amoeboid cells, these large amoeba. These little guys are bacteria. Don't worry about those. This is an amoeba, but then they come together. So this is one cell. What you're looking at here is, I don't know, thousands of cells that have come together to form this big blob. And then that big blob will then organize itself to become this huge stalk with its reproductive structure up here. So you'll see this in action. All right, moving on to algae. So algae are going to be plant-like protists, right? They're not true plants. And the difference is, by the way, this is a little bit of a sneak preview. Plants are, they evolved to live on land. So they are going to have roots and they're going to have leaves and stems. Algae evolved to be in the water. So algae are water organisms. And so they're not going to have roots and stems and things like that. So algae, these are the categories of the algae that you'll need to remember for the test. So let's start with these. The word plankton here, much of plankton is unicellular algae. So plankton is the film of microbes on the surface of water. And a lot of fish and whales will depend on plankton for their nutrition. And they largely don't move. They drift on the water, or they might weakly swim, but they're just kind of floating on the water there. So let's look at dinoflagellates. So dinoflagellates will be found in the ocean. They are going to have cellulose sort of walls or plates. They're very abundant in plankton, so they're floating on the surface of the ocean. They have flagella, which is in their name, right? Flagellates, they have flagella. And the one thing about dinoflagellates that I would like you to remember is that they cause a something called red tide. So when there is sort of a perfect circumstance for their overgrowth, then they overgrow, this is called a bloom, and they create lots and lots of toxin, and they actually create a red color to the ocean. So when you see this red tide, that tells you that it's a huge amount of dinoflagellates. The dinoflagellates make a toxin that the shellfish and the fish, when they eat the dinoflagellates, they eat the toxin, and then all of a sudden the fish and the shellfish are now toxic. And so if we were to eat the fish or shellfish, we would get food poisoning. So we cannot eat fish or shellfish during a red tide because we'll get poisoned. The next one, letter B, diatoms. These are really beautiful organisms you can see here. They're like very geometric. Their walls are made of silica, and silica is a precursor. I mean, it's in sand, but it makes glass, right? So these are basically almost glass-like organisms. They fit together like a box. They have two halves, and they store oil. So they create an oil as their energy source, which isn't surprising. Lots of plants make oil, right? There's avocado oil, olive oil, and then in different oils, we make fat, animals make fats, but diatoms make oil. And it turns out that the oil reserves that we use today for our gasoline in our cars is really not from dinosaurs. I think that's a myth. They're from diatom fossils because these are the oil storage. They created the oil in the first place. Next, we have green algae. Green algae is going to be unicellular and colonial. Or they can be filamentous. You can see here the hair-like filamentous green algae in a pond. We call that pond scum. This is our colonial microorganism, which is the volvox. So sometimes colonial, forming a hollow ball of flagellated cells, the volvox. So what's you need to know here is that each dot, each small little green dot is a volvox cell. Each one of these is flagellated, okay? So this larger colony is a ball of these little tiny flagellated cells, and inside they have baby colonies waiting to come out. So those larger green dots, those are all smaller colonies. So a colony is a system where cells work together when they are together, but when they're separated, they're not going to die because they're not completely dependent on each other for life. But when they are in a colony, they start to diverge or specialize jobs. So their function gets specialized within a colony. All right. So green algae, the other thing you want to know is that these are the guys that are most related to plants. So plants evolved from green algae. All right, so this is a wrap up of what we have so far. Our dinoflagellate. This is our diatoms, which are very beautiful and have oil, and their walls are made of silica. This is a single-celled algae with flagella. And here's our colonial volvox. Now the seaweeds. So we have 3 different kinds of seaweed. All right, so seaweeds are the exception to the rule. They're going to be multicellular because we can see seaweed. They're big enough. They're made of many cells. And they're based on their pigments. There's green algae, red algae, or brown algae. They all can photosynthesize. Okay, and these seaweeds are going to be the ancestor to plants. Again, green algae falls under this. There's some green algae seaweeds, so they're an ancestor to the land plants. So here's an image of them: green algae, red algae, brown algae. This is kelp. And one interesting thing is nori, the seaweed that we eat on sushi, is actually a form of red algae, this guy right here, which name is Porphyra. And it gets darker when it's dried, which is why it looks black, but it's actually a form of red algae. Okay, so I don't have any more information on algae, but you should know that brown algae is kelp. This is really, really fast growing kind of algae, red algae and green algae. The algae that's here, we eat algae, of course. We eat seaweed, we eat, nori, but it's not a very good form of energy in terms of calories. So it's a good flavoring, it's a good physical wrap, but it's not actually a good form of calories because we can't digest some of the components of seaweed. All right, so let's wrap this up here. What is the connection from Multicellular organisms have specialized cells that are dependent on each other and perform different functions such as feeding, waste disposal, gas exchange, and protection. So when you're truly multicellular, you're going to specialize. The cells that are in your body have been specialized to the point where they have to depend on other cells with other specialties to sustain life. So think about your body. If you were to take a heart cell out or a skin cell away that's alive, it's going to die immediately because it depends on your cardiovascular system to feed it oxygen. It depends on the digestive system to break down nutrients to feed it, right? So your cells have been specialized to the point that they can no longer live on their own. So a truly multicellular organism, those cells cannot live on their own anymore. They're tied to the organism. But the word colonial, when you have a colonial organism, those cells work together when they're together, but they can also carry on all of life's sort of, systems or chemical reactions without that colony. So they can exhibit separation of or specialization. They exhibit different job specialties in a colony, but they're not restricted to be alive in that colony. I hope that makes sense. So the volvox was one of these examples. The volvox, when it's in the colony, there are some that produce gametes, and then they depend on the somatic cells for feeding or moving around. So there's some specialization here. So they think in this picture that the colony, right, a colonial organism is the precursor to a multicellular organism. So here is a unicellular protist. Here is an ancestral colony, right? So we have a lot of protists kind of coming together. They're dividing, but they remain attached to each other. And then they can start to sort of separate their jobs, right? The cells in the colony may become specialized and interdependent. So some cells will become just food synthesizing cells. Some cells might develop a flagella to move around. Remember, each job that the cell does takes energy. So if you have to make a flagella and synthesize food, that takes a lot of energy. But if you separate your jobs, then you can conserve that energy and be better at synthesizing food, for example, right? And then we have another specialization here, a gamete, a reproductive cell being made that can go off and sort of create another organism, right? So the word somatic means body cells. So somatic cells do not create gametes, and of course gamete cells are special for reproduction. All right, so that wraps it up. So that's how we believe that we created a multicellular organism, is that the unicellular organism first became colonial. The colonies started to specialize and specialize until we get sort of a multicellular organism. Couple questions to wrap up. Which algal group is most closely related to plants? Is it seaweed, red algae, green algae, or brown algae? And the answer is green algae. Of the following, which describes protists most exclusively? Are protists multicellular or eukaryotes, protozoans, eukaryotes that are not plants, fungi, or animals, single-celled organisms related to bacteria? So, is multicellular eukaryotes descriptive of protists? No, because they're mostly unicellular. Are they protozoans? No, because this is just one category, right? There's protozoans, there's algae, and there's slime molds, so that's not going to be your answer. Are they eukaryotes that are not plants, fungi, or animals? Yes, this is the best descriptive term. Are they single-celled organisms related to bacteria? In some way they are, way back, but no, this is not going to be your answer here. All right, and that's it.